If you'd like to follow along, you can turn to Mark chapter 14. We'll be there in just a moment. Mark chapter 14. Today's lesson might be a little more difficult than some of the other lessons that we usually have before we partake of the Lord's Supper. It has been more difficult for me to prepare, having to talk and think so much about the pain that Jesus endured while he was on the cross. Many times we come and we talk about that, but then we just let it go for maybe years at a time before we address it again. I think it's important for us to continually come back to it on occasion. And what I want to do and why I want to do it today is next week I am going to preach on the resurrection of Jesus. And I want us to get a full feel for just how much Jesus went through for us on the cross. I want us to imagine this entire week leading up to next week, just how thorough Satan felt his victory was. I want us to think about how the apostles would have felt in the defeat that they had suffered, and the vindication that the Jewish leaders would have felt for those days Jesus was in the cross. We have put this guy to death in the worst way imaginable. We have succeeded. We've been vindicated. He's gone. He's done. We now can establish ourselves back as the leaders of this nation. People will come to the temple to hear what we have to say now instead of what this rebel had to say. The vindication that they felt during those 3 days, I want us to think about that a little bit as we head into a lesson where we're going to talk about the resurrection of Jesus. To be honest with you, I'm sort of amazed that the Bible doesn't spend more time detailing how painful the events of the cross really were. But the pain started before Jesus actually went through the first phase of the trial, where he was beaten. I want to read a passage in Deuteronomy 25 to just show you how God was passionate even to those who were disobedient. It says there in Deuteronomy 25, is there a dispute between men, and they come to court, that the judge may judge them, and they justify the righteous and condemn the wicked. And it shall be, if the wicked man deserves to be beaten, then the judge will cause him to lie down and be beaten in his presence, according to his guilt, with a certain number of blows. 40 blows he may be given is the most allowed. It cannot exceed 40 blows, as was the Jewish law that God gave. That was the limit that he put on that. The Romans had no such limit. But let's look at Mark chapter 14 and verse 61. We talked about these men and how they mocked Jesus a couple weeks ago. And the same verses that tell us that they mocked Jesus, it brings out the pain that they were caused. And just like the mocking, it seemed like there was mocking at every stage. Jesus was around these people. They wanted to mock him before they sent him to the next group. And when the next group received him, they wanted to mock him before they sent him to the next group. The same seems to be the case with the pain Jesus endured. Mark chapter 14 and verse 61 says this, again the high priest asked him, saying to him, are you the Christ, the Son of God, the blessed? Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man sitting at the right hand of power and coming with the clouds of heaven. Then the high priest tore his clothes and said, what further need do we have of witnesses? You have heard the blasphemy. What do you think? And all of them said, commend him, saying he's deserving of death. Then some began to spit on him, the humiliation we talked about, blindfold him, and to beat him, and to say to him, prophesy, and the offer struck him with the palm of their hands. Luke's account makes it seem like some of these blows happened before this first trial even started. Now, this morning I did something, I don't know if I should have done it or not, but I looked up a video about, they actually have slapping contests now. Have you seen those? Slapping contest, where two people will stand across from each other, and one person would just be like this, standing there, and the other person will go like this, get ready, and then whack. Well, the first one, I watched it for 2 minutes. I'm not into that pain being inflicted on somebody. I don't like the UFC, all the blood and all that good stuff. Some of you might like that. I don't care for that. So the first one I saw were these two girls. They were, really normal-looking 22-year-old thin girls. And they slapped each other, and their head went like this, and, they smiled and they walked away. Then out came these two beasts of men, and they stood across from each other. And the first guy slapped the other guy, and he almost lost it. He was just staggering with this slap. And then the other guy reached over and slapped him, knocked him down to the ground. There's two things here that Jesus endured. One was slapping. Now, we might it's just a slap on the face. What's the big deal? Well, these were men, adult men that were slapping him. So that had to be very painful. But there's another term that's mentioned here, and it says they beat him. That word beat means closed fist. So not only did Jesus endure the open slaps of people mocking him, but endured fist punches in the face, probably in the stomach, bent over, unable to defend himself. When that was done, Jesus probably already had swollen eyes. His lips were probably already bleeding, and his nose may have been bleeding as well. He was starting to be disfigured in a way that his mom eventually wouldn't be able to recognize him. Well, he's passed on from the Jews to the Gentiles, to the Romans. And as I was thinking about this week, I don't mean to be insulting to anyone, but what was happening is Jesus was being passed from the Jewish boys to the Roman men. Let that sink in for a second. The Romans were the real men of torture. They knew how to do it. Their law had nothing to do with 29 or 39 stripes. These men who were about to torture Jesus did not have anything holding them back, except the brink of death. Their goal was to get Jesus to the brink of death without killing him. In Matthew chapter 27 and verse 26, this is after they had this conversation about, who do you want me to release to you, Barabbas or Jesus? Barabbas the murderer, or Jesus who is the king of the Jews? After Pilate has already said Jesus was innocent. It says, then he released Barabbas to them, and he scourged Jesus. He delivered him to be crucified. John 19 says about the same thing. But notice this. The scourging was not something that we're familiar with. I know we've studied this and talked about this, but it's good to bring it back to our minds. These whips themselves were usually had at least 3 leather straps coming out of a wooden handle. It could be more. And on those straps were pieces of metal, pieces of bone, sometimes pieces of glass, nails, things that were intended to inflict the greatest amount of pain possible. The position of the victim was usually on his knees or lying down to some degree over a post and attached to that post. You remember when you used to get a spanking from your parents, you had to put your hands on the couch or on the bed or something. That's what we had to do, put your hands on the couch. In other words, I don't want you moving. I want your hands out of the way so that I can spank you like you deserve to be spanked. Remember, Jesus had already been beaten with fists, slapped, and beaten by the Jews. The beating would take place with 2 Roman soldiers, each with one of those whips. One of them would be on one side and the other one on the other side. And just the anticipation of what was coming next would be terrible. I'm telling you, if you gave one of these whips to a 10-year-old kid in this room, I would beg for mercy. If you give these 2 whips to these trained Roman soldiers, I'd be begging for death. As one of them would take that whip and the whips would come down on the back of the accused. In my notes, I have the word victim a lot of times. Prisoner, victim, whatever the case may be. The whip was not intended to hit the back of Jesus and slide off. It was intended to stick into the back of the one that they were beating. And the Romans were talented with the flick of the wrist. The way that they could flick the wrist back up would bring the bone, the glass, the nails. Some even had hooks on them. And not only would the whip come up, so would flesh. As I was thinking about this, the Romans weren't trying to inflict whelps on people, raised spots on your back that would eventually go away with very little medical treatment. They weren't trying to inflict injury on people, on Jesus, that would require a doctor to give him 20 stitches. I read one thing there. Each time that whip came across with those bones, each time it would be at least 20 stitches. That's how big the cut would be. But that's not what they were intending to do. Their intent was to leave Jesus so disfigured and so marred that even the most talented group of surgeons, cosmetic surgeons, could not bring his body back to look normal again. That was their intent. The name for the whip that was used, we get our term fillet from that. Think about that. What was intended was to have boneless segments of flesh to be taken from the body of the victim. Those who witnessed crucifixions and these beatings before the crucifixions have testified that you could see muscle, you could see organs sometimes, and in the worst case, you could actually see the spine of the victim. Jesus went through excruciating pain on our behalf. Just the beating alone. I told you, we would all be begging for mercy for that not to happen. Then, these same people put a crown of thorns on his head and beat that head down with a reed. And they put that robe on him, and you imagine his back is just shredded. And that robe, every time he moved, it would have hurt. And then when they took it off, it would have been such pain as they took that robe off of him. Then he had to carry the crossbeam, at least for a while. We know that he fell beneath the weight of that, and someone else carried it. The way the crossbar was described is like a railroad tie. You ever seen a railroad tie? Very rough. We used to do work with railroad ties. We used to build railroad tie walls. And most of the time, us boys would have to have two people to pick them up. We were teenagers. It would take one on one side, one on the other. My dad could pick one up and put it over his shoulder, which we thought was amazing. But we had to have two. Jesus was carrying this rough railroad tie on his shoulder or maybe over his shoulder. That in and of itself, with the splinters and rubbing against his open wounds, would have been almost impossible. And some of this stuff, we don't really need to explain in great detail, because you look at this idea, all of us know that it would hurt to get a nail driven through your wrist. We don't have to imagine. Right here, you escape the two ligaments, but you hit the most important nerve that goes through your hand. And it's caused pain through your thumb, your fingers, just terrible, terrible pain that would have been associated with that. And then usually the foot would have been laid against the crossbar, or the post, and the other foot on top, and one nail driven through both. Every time Jesus needed to breathe, he had to push up on his feet and lift up with his arms. Every time that would have been painful. Not to even think about the back, how that much that would have hurt for him to go through all of that as well. Jesus suffered immense and total pain in a way that you and I can't even begin to imagine. When he did that, the Jews thought they were vindicated when he went through that. The devil thought he had won, and the apostles felt defeated. You know what you and I should feel? A combination of being sick to our stomach, feeling guilty, and we should feel loved. Because what Jesus did that day and what he went through was to save us from going through that, and was to save us from going through much worse, an eternal separation from God. And so while these type of times we get together and talk about this, it's so much better to talk about a miracle Jesus performed and a character trait that Jesus had. And that's typically what we do, but today I wanted to bring us back to the pain Jesus suffered on the cross and let us think about that blood that heals us from our sins. He was, Isaiah talks about it, when this was done, he was unrecognizable. He didn't look like himself. His mother wouldn't even recognize him on the street. And he did that for all of us. Praise Jesus for going through that so that we could be forgiven.